Welcome back to Explosive Enterprises. We recently passed 20,000 subscribers, which is a pretty big milestone, so I thought it was time to do another Q&A, and in particular to do something a little special for this one. I asked around on the Heavy Recoil Club Discord, and the thing that people really want to see apparently is a cooking video. So today we're going to be making baked chicken wings with a buffalo-inspired hot sauce, and also going to make a tiki drink to go along with it. So let's get right into that. First things first, preheat the oven to 250 Fahrenheit or 120 Celsius, and then dry out your chicken wings. I'll be cooking 3 pounds or 1.4 kilograms of wings here, and I individually pat each one dry with paper towels and add it to a bowl. Now the secret ingredient here is baking powder. Make sure to use one that doesn't include aluminum, as that will add a metallic taste, and measure out about a tablespoon for every pound or half kilogram of wings. The science behind why this works is disputed, but it definitely helps the wings to crisp when baked in the oven rather than deep fried as is traditional. To this, I'll add some chili powder, a generous amount of cayenne, garlic powder, a little bit of cumin, a lot of hot paprika, a bit of pepper, and a lot of salt. You can use whatever seasonings you like, just make sure to add salt as that will also help to draw out moisture. I'll stir this up to mix, and then add it to the wings a bit at a time, tossing them by hand to ensure even coverage. This spice mix should be sufficient to fully coat all the wings and have a bit left over. Next, I transfer the wings to an oiled wire rack on a baking sheet with the skin facing up. The rack isn't strictly necessary, but it does help to ensure all sides get crispy. So, into the oven and set a timer for 30 minutes. While that cooks, it's time for a drink, and as mentioned before, we'll do a tiki style. I think tiki drinks get a bad rap as either liquid diabetes or girls' drinks, and lately I've been in a nautical mood, so I'm going to make my personal spin on a classic tiki drink called a Navy Grog. First off, this calls for 3/4 ounce of fresh lime juice. Not bottled, it has to be fresh. Lemon and lime juices don't store well, and only fresh juice has the brightness to stand up to the other ingredients. Next is 3/4 ounce of grapefruit juice, and this you can juice and store frozen and just thaw when needed. Next is a full ounce of honey syrup, which is just honey and water in equal proportion, which makes it a lot easier to pour and mix. Into the shaker it goes. Now for the rums, and I'll be using 3 of them. First up is Smith & Cross minimally aged Jamaican pot still overproof rum with a taste that I've seen described as bananas soaked in gasoline. And not wrong, this is a lively spirit to slug it out with the fruit juice, and I'll add 1 ounce. Next is Appleton Estate Signature, also a Jamaican pot still, but a little more mellow and aged for longer in oak barrels. This tames the Smith & Cross a bit while still adding some of its own character. Again, a full ounce. And lastly, Cruzan Single Barrel, a blended rum but predominantly the cleaner, more neutral column still variety, aged for longer. An ounce of this adds some wood and char as backbone to an otherwise fruity and funky drink. And lastly, taking a page out of Don the Beachcomber, I'll add a dash of Angostura and a dash equivalent of absinthe. No, absinthe won't make you go blind or insane or any other myths a temperance movement cooked up, but it is a very strong flavor, so a little goes a long ways. I fill the shaker with crushed ice, and it's time to shake. It's now ice cold, so I get out my appropriate tiki mug and open pour the drink into it. Then top up with just a bit of club soda to lengthen it a little further. Add a grass straw, a sprig of fresh mint from my garden, and a bit of fresh grated nutmeg, and the Navy Grog is complete. It's a good drink. Back to the wings. While they cook, I'll get out 4 tablespoons of butter and put it in a small pot, then set it by the oven vents where the emitted heat will soften it. After 30 minutes, I take the baking sheet out and make sure none of the wings are sticking to the rack, then crank the temperature up to 425 Fahrenheit or 220 Celsius and put them back in for another 45 minutes. While that's going, it's time for the sauce. Traditional buffalo sauce will just mix Franks and butter in equal measure, but I prefer to go heavier on the Franks and then doctor it as well with a bit of extra cayenne and garlic and stir on low heat until it's fully dissolved. Don't let it boil or it'll break and the oil will separate out. Once that's together, I'll add a special ingredient. A single brain-strained chili pepper from my garden, clocking in at a modest 1 million or so Scovilles, will add a little extra heat and habanero-like fruity flavor after having some time to steep and integrate. When the timer goes off, the wings are done, and I can carefully remove them from the pan and add to a large bowl, which I use to toss the wings with the sauce. Serve with celery, and there you have it, baked hot wings. None of the mess involved in deep frying, but still a nice crispy shell that holds the sauce. Well, now that we've completed our special activity that has absolutely nothing to do with this being an Airsoft channel, let's get into the Q&A. What is your thought on the narrative that people seem to have that the Army intentionally sabotaged the M16 during its adoption? Okay, so this was originally, I was going to talk about this in the M16 review, and I cut it from the script because it isn't directly related to the Airsoft one, and I figured most people probably wouldn't want to sit through talk about the myths and misconceptions that went into the M16's development. This rifle was never intentionally sabotaged by Army. There were a bunch of problems that came up during development that each individually contributed to it underperforming, and it's just a lot more complicated than people seem to think. So this story actually starts in 1952 when Army's Operations Research Office publishes a report entitled Operational Requirements for an Infantry Hand Weapon. And this is kind of a compilation of existing research that had been done, and it was very forward-leaning for the time, and it's the source of a number of principles that Army takes for granted even today. That the maximum range of most infantry engagements is under 300 yards, that the average soldier cannot effectively engage a target beyond 300 yards with anywhere near as much effectiveness, that the winner of a firefight is more commonly decided by who can get more lead down range and not by individual marksmanship, and maybe most significantly, that a small caliber high velocity projectile is just as lethal as a bigger, slower one. Not that it's lethal enough, not that it's designed to wound or any of that other FUD lore kind of stuff, that it's equally lethal. And so Army basically looks at this and they conclude, okay, so our next weapon is going to fire small caliber projectiles at very high velocity, and it's going to maximize the number of projectiles that go downrange with each trigger pull, and they start putting a lot of funding into Project Salvo, Project Spew, these ideas for flechettes, for duplex ammunition, for multi-barrel firearms, and they're thinking that's going to replace the M14 eventually, which is in the process of being adopted, and is a fairly straightforward iteration on the M1 Garand rifle. So we're going to adopt something conservative, and then one of these research projects is going to come back with a new whiz-bang assault rifle, and that's going to be what we're going to adopt in like 10 or 15 years. Okay, so fast forward to 1962, and a DoD report says that the M14 is completely inferior to the M1 Garand. The M14 is having a lot of problems, and this is becoming a public scandal. And Salvo and Spew are still at least 10 years out. They're not ready. They're nowhere near ready. They'll never be ready. So Army needs a new weapon. And they see that Air Force in 1962 has adopted the Colt, well, it's a Colt 601 at that point. They're working on adopting what will become the M16. Army's also involved in Project Agile, which is an ARPA program that's investigating small arms for distribution to guerrilla forces in South Vietnam, and they're testing the Colt 601 and derivatives as well. So in 1963, Army decides to adopt what will become the M16. So the Ordnance Board is going to handle the rifle, while Frankfurt Arsenal handles the ammo. And okay, so we're going to get a bunch of guns from Colt, we're going to go to the manufacturers for ammunition and get them to manufacture ammo, and they immediately have a problem because no manufacturer is willing to bid on the contract to make the ammo. Let's back up a second, because the way this narrative usually goes is that Colt or Armalite specified stick ammunition and Big Army changed it to ball ammunition to sabotage, and that just ruined everything. Armalite and Colt never specified the propellant that was initially used. That's IMR 4475, and that was chosen by Remington. Remington had developed the TDP for the ammunition alongside Armalite during the gun's initial development, and they used IMR 4475 because that's what they were using to manufacture 7.62x51. Same powder, easier for them logistically. What they found was that IMR 4475 was just barely capable of producing the paper specifications required for the cartridge. And because every batch of propellant is a little bit different, they were getting batches that would produce serviceable ammunition, but it would exceed the pressure limitations specified for the cartridge. And excess pressure was causing problems like popped primers, headspace issues. It's just bad news all around. And it's one thing if you're doing like a small R&D project and you can just cherry pick the exact lots of propellant that are going to do the job and be within spec and be safe. It's another thing if you have to now supply all the ammunition that Army wants, and you no longer have that luxury of being able to cherry pick. And none of the manufacturers wanted to do this. They were not willing to tolerate the rejection rate that they would have if they just used the propellant as is. So they met with Frankfurt Arsenal, and they basically had three options. They could lower the velocity of the cartridge, which is a 3250 FPS on a 55 grain projectile. It's screaming fast. They can increase the maximum pressure that's allowed and maybe redesign the gun to accommodate it, but that's going to take a lot of time. That's going to take some design effort. There could be other implications, or they can change propellants. They had tested a bunch of propellants already. The IMR 4475 had met the requirements during the initial stages of testing, but there are other propellants out there. Now, in the meantime, in early 1964, they've ordered 85,000 XM16 E1s, and just to get ammo out the door to have something to actually shoot from these guns, they issue a temporary waiver for max pressure. So ammunition does go into the field, loaded with the 4475 stick propellant, and it will have problems as a result. But it is used. So, in the meantime, they test a bunch of alternative propellants, and the one that's favored is WC846, which is a ball propellant. So, the manufacturers like that it's quicker to produce, Frankfurt Arsenal likes that it's safer to store, Air Force has already bought ammo that had been loaded with it for testing, and they liked it. Colt actually tested it, and they noted that it had an increased rate of fire. This is due to increased port pressure. This would be the problem that's associated with the ball ammunition, but Colt didn't experience any problems with it in testing, and a lead Colt engineer actually put out a report saying that he felt that it would probably make the gun operate more reliably. So Colt approved of this change, and ironically, it's the Ordnance Board, who usually gets blamed for the decision, that was the most skeptical. Because remember, the whole idea of that operational requirements document was that the more lead you can accurately get downrange, the more effective you'll be in a firefight. And so they wanted a controllable, fully automatic rifle. They're not going to get a duplex ammunition. They're not going to get a multi-barrel rifle, no flechettes, none of that weirdness. So we're just going to settle for something that's full auto, but controllable full auto, much more so than a full-size 308 battle rifle. And that's going to let us just put accurate fire. Well, if you have too high a rate of fire, you have more recoil, it's harder to control, it's not going to be effective. So when Army sees that the new rate of fire with the new propellant is beyond the paper spec that was allowed for the XM16 E1, they're concerned about that. Air Force doesn't care. They just change the specs on paper and boom, okay, it's approved, let's go. 3 martini lunch, taxpayer expense. Army issues waivers to allow for a higher rate of fire, but they're not going to change the spec, which means at any time they can just stop issuing waivers and say, okay, you got to figure this out. We're not going to accept this. So, because this is a temporary solution, they're going to keep testing and production begins. So, now the XM16 E1s, they're being fielded in Vietnam, they have this new ammunition loaded with ball propellant, and everything goes wrong. Well, what exactly went wrong? Well, let's see. The original buffer design could seize shut with rust, and then instead of buffering properly, it would just bounce off the back of the receiver extension tube, and this would increase the rate of fire. Magazines had a lot of problems with feeding quickly enough, chambers were out of spec and would actually rust, gas tubes had corrosion issues, magazines were also easily crushed, so basically you have a weapon that is, due to mechanical design, cycling faster than it should, then it's being loaded with ammo that makes it cycle faster than it should, using magazines that can't keep up with the higher fire rate, and then most of all having rust and out-of-spec chambers, which means that when the rifle then goes to extract very quickly under high pressure, it tears the casings and it leaves part of them in the chamber. And then you compound that with a lack of cleaning kits. There's a little bit of a myth that goes into that. The Army did try to procure cleaning kits. They couldn't get enough from Colt. They didn't feel it would be an issue because Colt marketed the gun as self-cleaning, and it sure seemed to be pretty reliable in adverse conditions in testing. It's just the testing was largely done in the US and Alaska and not actually in the steaming jungles of Vietnam. So you have a cleaning kit for every 3 or 4 guys, which would probably be fine. I mean, that's not atypical historically, except that if they actually need to repair the weapon in combat, that's going to be a problem. So the other thing that doesn't get talked about enough is that most of the troops issued the XM16E1 were not adequately trained on it. There were no extra rifles for stateside training, so most troops would be trained on the M14, then they get sent to Vietnam, they're immediately issued a rifle, given minimal time to familiarize themselves on it, and sent into combat. There are differences in maintenance between an M16 and an M14, especially having to do with the caliber difference. Like, for example, you get capillary action in the barrel. It's much easier for water to get trapped in the barrel and start to form rust. So basically this all adds up to, you're going to go out on patrol in the morning, maybe get in a firefight early in the day. You're not going to clean the weapon immediately. You're going to wait maybe like 6 hours, 8 hours, complete your patrol. And in that amount of time, it could develop enough rust in the chamber that when you go to fire, it's just going to be stuck. That has nothing to do with the propellant. There were serious design problems and manufacturing problems with the rifles themselves. Colt was taken to task by Army for this. They made a ton of changes between the XM16E1 and the M16A1. You can actually identify the month of production of an XM16E1 just by looking at what combination of features it has. And by the end of it, they really did iron out the problems with the gun, and they made it function with the ball propellant. So eventually, after a lot of testing, Frankfurt Arsenal did discover one other problem that was relevant. Some of the batches of ammunition made with this WC-846 ball propellant had high calcium carbonate content, up to the 1% that was allowed in the specs, and that was used to neutralize acid during production. If they had a lot of this calcium carbonate, a chalk essentially, it would cause fouling in the gas system. Most batches of ammunition did not have this problem. It was only discovered after extensive testing. So the manufacturer, Olin, they revised the specification on the ammo to 1/4 the limited calcium carbonate, 0.25%, and they designated that WC-844, and that is the propellant that is still used on mil-spec ammunition today. So that ball propellant that everyone blames for ruining the M16, that is standard 5.56 that has been in use for 60 years, 60-some years now. It's really just that the guns were not initially designed around it, and these problems would only come up in testing. I think there's a tendency to paint this as a story with heroes and villains because it's more exciting, it's more dramatic, but the reality is that military procurement is not exciting. I do this for work, it sucks. And it's really less of a story of good versus evil and more of a story of just how complicated it is to take a gun from a commercial research project to the standard issue rifle of an entire military in under 10 years. And the fact that they were able to pull it off with as few issues as they did, relatively speaking, is pretty impressive. John Garand would actually go on record defending the M16, pointing out that his rifle had a whole bunch of problems too when it was initially introduced. It just wasn't a scandal because it happened in peacetime and it could be worked out in training exercises and not in a combat environment. So that's that. Absolutely nothing to do with Airsoft, but hope you enjoy that little bit of history. Anyways, let's move on. Okay, we got some really great comments on the load-bearing equipment video. So, good video. You forgot to cover assault vests, however. The SADF P83 and the Bundeswehr KSK assault vests are fine examples for their class. We got a couple comments along those same lines. Yeah, that's actually kind of embarrassing because the very first piece of gear I ever bought was a Blackhawk assault vest. Oh, I'm sorry, there's an exclamation point. That's Blackhawk! Whatever. And yeah, this is a little bit different from the chest rigs we talked about. I would argue that from a classification standpoint, these are fundamentally chest rigs. And the reason for that is because they're still designed to hang all the weight from the shoulders rather than distributing it to the belt. Now, they do have some differences from more modern chest rigs. They tend to spread out the pouches across the body, so you get a little more even weight distribution. They don't project out as far. And yeah, I mean, there are some really great options there. I just don't think they're all that different from the chest rigs that we already covered. So if you have one that works for you, all the better. Now, you can make that assault vest concept a little more of a hybrid approach by attaching a belt to it and cinching the belt enough that it distributes some weight to the hips. So then you get kind of both the chest rig and belt rig advantages in one. And that's basically what the LBV-88 example we showed was, being hooked up to an Alice belt. The key there, like I said, is just you have to make sure that the belt is adjusted so it's going to distribute the weight to your hips. If it's just hanging from the rest of the vest and isn't tight against your waist, it's just going to be hanging all that weight off your shoulders and continuing to function as essentially just a chest rig. Where do you get your Russian gear from? We have a lot of comments asking specifically about the Gorka and the Cobra that I used on the Saiga. Get in your Wayback Machine and go back to like 2018. I actually got the Gorka on Amazon. There was a time when real bars, Gorkas, are being sold there. That's long gone. Cobra used to be you could just buy one online used on like Reddit for like $300. Can't get that anymore. Unfortunately, there aren't a lot of good options for replacements. I'm currently testing a Commando Store Gorka, which I'll maybe be able to speak about a little more once I've had some more time with it. For optics, your choices are limited and the repros are usually pretty bad, especially for the Cobra. I am testing a Vict Optics PKA clone that was like $100, and it's not very good, but for $100 of an optic that you otherwise can't really get much in the way of replicas of, bar is pretty low. So jury's still out on that. Really just, I know, I'm sorry it isn't very useful, but the answer is it's real stuff, but you can't get it the same way I did. Oh yeah, and speaking of Russian stuff, I have a bunch of comments asking if we're going to review the VFC AK. I'm sorry to say that while we really did want to review the AK, we've had a little bit of an issue with VFC, and it turns out... Nah, I'm just kidding. Yeah, look forward to a review on this. It's going to be at least probably 3 or 4 weeks out. We just want to make sure that we have enough time to properly evaluate it. There's a lot of people have a lot of hopes riding on this gun. What do you think about the new system used in the ENL T191? On paper, it has all the benefits of all the different systems: realism of gas blowback, usability in cold environments from the HPA, and cheap AEG magazines. I've actually been surprised that that isn't more common as a design. I mean, you have the Daytona guns, which are iterations on the old Escort system, but those don't have the realistic manual of arms. They're essentially more like HPA engines in how they behave. Really, you just have this T191 and like the Tippmann M4 for guns that behave like gas blowback, but just use HPA. And I think, yeah, there's a lot of advantages going for that. You just have HPA going into the gun, and then you don't need to worry about gas, you don't need to worry about temperature. It will work just as consistently and reliably as an AEG or HPA, but you still get blowback and you still get that realistic manual of arms. Actually, the most interesting system I've seen was the Alien Airsoft conversion kits for Wii rifles, which converted them to HPA. That was pretty cool. Don't know why no one else has picked up on it. I mean, I'd probably buy one. My biggest hesitation with the 191 is that I've heard some pretty bad things about the performance of that gun. Someone has offered one for review for us, so hopefully we can get to that sooner rather than later. Is there any chance to make a review about the best V3 VFC GBB system? I was thinking about the BCM, whether I should get it or not. They're all the same. Some of them have more steel or more aluminum parts, well, pot metal parts. That's what we covered in the VFC AR review. Beyond that, all the ARs are the same. Just pick whatever one you like to look up most. Oh, except for the difference between the rotary hop and guide hop. That's the other probably relevant difference between them.
Hey guys, so we actually had a couple of questions this time around that fell into my wheelhouse, so taking a crack at those. First one was, do you have any plans to make a video on how to build the flamethrower you were using in one of your early videos? So that commenter is referring to a video that we filmed at Ballahack Airsoft where all three of us were acting as sort of like Techno Hoarder, Adeptus Mechanicus guys at one of their Rev games, NPCs. Ton of fun. Unfortunately, my flamethrower doesn't exist in that configuration anymore. I think Catgut's might still exist more or less exactly like that, but mine over the years has been cannibalized and turned into this thing, which is our sort of like 40K-ish themed flamethrower. It has been featured in some other YouTube videos on other channels, but never on ours. So we do fully intend to do like an overview video on this. Not a direct tutorial, but just an overview on the design, the concept, how we made it, things like that. Actually, we want to do that for a lot of our homemade stuff, overview videos on the Delisle and the scythe that you see behind me there. Just kind of have to figure out the format for those, since they're a little bit different from the normal reviews that we would do. But once we get that figured out, definitely expect at least an overview video on this. A direct tutorial like the commenter was asking about, probably not. We've always been a little bit squirrely about teaching people to build these things, or we were actually even considering selling them at one point, just because you could do a lot of damage with these. So without a ton of effort, you can crank the power up on these and have very high rates of fire and very, very high power in a very simple gun that can do a ton of damage to somebody. So we're not super comfortable with that. We don't want the reputation of these things to be that they are high power, high rate of fire, dangerous guns. We want the reputation of them to be something that's like low power, high rate of fire, kind of a fun like side grade concept where they're very short range, but they have a very high rate of fire that kind of integrates into the balance of a normal airsoft game. Not something that's going to injure somebody. And because they are homemade, a lot of fields can get kind of weird about them, but the first time we shoot anybody with these things to the power that we have them tuned to, they're like, oh, that's totally fine. It's like getting rained on with BBs. So not something that anybody worries about once they experience it. But we don't want somebody to go out there and field it cranked up just for shock value or something like that, and ultimately give these things a bad reputation. So probably no direct tutorial, but definitely an overview video at some point.
If you want to build one for yourself, do a Google search for Vortex Strafer. That's the design that these are based on, and you can probably piece it together yourself. If you search one-day flamethrower build, you'll probably find an Arnie's Airsoft forum post where I talked about the one that I made. If you have a little bit of technical know-how, you can put one together for yourself pretty easily, and that is just enough of a barrier to entry to the kind of people that we expect would abuse it.
So another one that we had was, love the 40mm content, thank you very much. Do you have any videos of 3D printed shells? That's what I want the most. So he might be referring to these 3D printed shells that are really actually just heads for Avengers 40mm shell bases, which are nice. You can add 3D printed heads to these really easily because everything gas-wise is self-contained in here, rather than some shells that use the upper part here as the actual gas reservoir. On these guys, you can add whatever kinds of 3D printed heads you want to them, so we've had a couple different designs that we've put together. The tag version of this is already up on our Thingiverse page, and honestly isn't really worth making a whole video about. They perform pretty much exactly the same as a normal tag shell, maybe slightly better, just because theoretically there's a little bit more gas in these than there is in a tag shell, but beyond that, nothing really worth making an entire video about. Maybe a YouTube short that compares this to a normal tag brand tag shell, just to see if there is a performance difference, but beyond that, no real crazy difference in performance there. This version we definitely want to do a video on. This is the shotgun BB firing version of our 3D printed shell concept. This has its own speed loader that works for it. It uses wads, almost like an APS shotgun shell does, and has very good performance. Keeps a nice tight spread, has very long range when you're using CO2. Overall, definitely about as effective as it can get for a BB firing 40mm shell. We want to put this design up on Thingiverse and also make an overview video about it for sure. Just got to get a little bit more footage for it and use these outdoors. We've actually featured these in a video before, kind of accidentally. The beginning of the GL06 review has these running on propane or green gas in an indoor environment just to see how they work. They work great, as you can see in the beginning of that video. And they work even better outdoors. Again, just need a little bit more footage there, and we will definitely get a video out on these hopefully soon. This guy is a little bit more experimental. This is a version, basically just the head of a 40 mic or a 40 max Cyclops, that concept. So basically having a corkscrew of BBs going up through it that then runs up to a straight barrel so that you have what is basically something like a strafer, but it's a single shot. Even higher rate of fire than that, maybe like 200 to 300 rounds a second, that just goes in like a nice straight line as if they're coming out of a single barrel, which is what they're doing here. Honestly, this doesn't seem to perform any better than the 40 max Cyclops or a 40 mic, so it doesn't seem super useful. It's also really, really long and kind of annoying to store. I find that these are more useful as a BB firing shell in almost every situation. These take a little bit of time to load. They can't handle CO2, just because the threads are so fine and this style of shell builds up so much more pressure, it tends to actually just launch the entire 3D printed head off of the base. So not super useful, unfortunately. Probably not a video on this. We might put the design up just to give folks the ability to tinker with it and see if maybe they can get it to work better. That'd be awesome. But beyond that, not too much more we're really going to do with this realistically. But definitely a video on these at some point, and we will have these probably more 3D printed head designs come up at some point in the future, and we'll definitely make videos on those as well.
Can you make a video on the GBB MP7 talking about the difference between TM and VFC mainly? Maybe not a video about specifically those two models. I'll tell you right now that I think the TM is a little bit outdated. It's a little fragile internally if you use it on propane, and the gun is undersized just because of the era that it came from. There was a mistake with dimensions. It's smaller than a real MP7. The VFC is interesting. I bought one and I intended to review it, and then I didn't review it because we keep doing way too many VFC reviews anyways, and then I ended up selling it because it wasn't really relevant to what I want. I say it's interesting because it's both a great starter gas gun and a terrible starter gas gun. It has reasonable kick, it's snappy, it's efficient, it's fairly low maintenance, like it works, but at the same time it has an awful trigger. You really can't tell when it's empty because the recoil impulse doesn't change, and it's absolutely terrible to work on internally. It's worse than an AEG gearbox. You have to just take apart the entire gun to access the hop. And so those are three things where normally I say, like, hey, these are advantages gas guns have over AEGs. You know when it's empty, you have a good trigger that will help you with your accuracy, they're easy to work on. Not the case with the MP7. It's otherwise a good replica, it's just kind of, there's a little extreme. So I don't know. We'll probably do a video on it in the future. Again, just don't want to keep doing all VFC all the time. AUG, H-bar, Dymaco LSW, or 249 Saw's favorite LMG? Well, I sold the H-bar, the AUG. I had a lot of fun with that gun. I think it was really great ergonomically, but the GHK design was really just not suited for the round count that I was putting through it, and it was really starting to show its wear and tear from, I want to say, like only like 40 or 50,000 rounds, which, I mean, for Airsoft, that's maybe a lot, but it's not for a machine gun. It's not for the way I shoot. So we're down to really just the Dymaco LSW, or Colt LMG, and the 249. Yeah, I don't know. The 249 we're still having hot problems with. That's something that we're going to resolve, and hopefully we'll have an upcoming video to talk about that, because I think we might have actually cracked it. Dymaco LSW, I'm actually switching that from a Vipertech build to a VFC build for ease of parts availability. I guess, again, we'll have to report back. The Dymaco LSW Colt LMG, it feels almost like cheating to use it as a light machine gun just because it is essentially a bigger, heavier M16, but as a result it has really nice ergonomics, and yeah, I like that gun a lot. Can we expect any more forgotten Airsoft? Even outside of the direct parody, I think it's a fun concept. Yeah, I do too. Honestly, just working on guns that old where there's no documentation on how to get them apart and put them back together scares the hell out of me. It took hours to get that Calico back together when the fire control group exploded into a million pieces. Pretty sure that stress took a year off my lifespan. I really didn't want to give it back to my teammate in a pile of parts. That would not be a good look. But yeah, I mean, if we can get our hands on anything interesting, I wouldn't rule it out. I'm just not committing to anything at this time. Comparing VFC Glock 17 and the Tokyo Marui Glock 17. Yeah, actually one of my teammates is currently working on that, in addition to a couple of other guns, because there are just so many variants on the market right now, so I don't have a firm ETA on that, but it's definitely something we're working on. Thanks for all your questions, guys, and as always, we really appreciate your support. Hopefully you found this interesting, and thanks for watching.